Hello and welcome back to Catalyzing Coherence. Today I am here with Dr. Ben Hunt. Thank you for joining the show.
Great to be here, Matthew. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Ben is a brilliant man. I truly have so much respect for you, Dr. Hunt. Just to give people a little bit of an idea of where you're coming from and your history, I wanted to go through just a little bit of a sampling of the things that you've done across the years to give people an idea of the breadth.
I can't keep a job. That's my problem.
That's
what my wife says anyway.
Quite the polymathic background.
Thanks.
So you are currently the chief investment strategist at Salient, a hedge fund.
Actually, that is as of 2 months ago. So I've left Salient to start my own firm.
Oh, congratulations!
Thank you.
I'm not entirely up to date then.
No. It's all good. Yeah, Salient's been my home for the last 5 years, and they're an asset manager, mostly mutual funds, about $13 billion. Down in Houston and also here in San Francisco, where we're recording this. But really, it's given me this great opportunity to build the publishing and research assets. And 2 months ago, we spun that out into a new firm that allowed me just to focus on the publishing and the research. So that's
congratulations.
That's no, thanks. So
that's wonderful.
The new firm is called Second Foundation Partners. It's my nod to Isaac Asimov and
I love
the Foundation trilogy.
Yeah, I'm sure the audience will definitely be.
Oh yeah,
that'll
yeah,
resonate
yeah,
with
yeah.
everybody in the audience as well. A lot of Asimov fans out there. So that's your kind of day job in the financial world.
That's right.
You have a deep history. You got a PhD at Harvard. I guess the Kennedy School probably.
I mean the Kennedy School is more of a mid-career program. So this was in the arts and science department, the Department of Government. Yeah. Well, they call it political science everywhere else, but at Harvard they still call it government for some weird
Harvard
reason.
has to be special.
I guess you're right. Yeah. And that's right. So I was a professor for 10 years, first at NYU, and then got a tenured spot down in Dallas at SMU. But to your point, I've always had the entrepreneurial bug, and I'm sure as many of your listeners and viewers know, it is a bug. It's not a feature.
Definitely.
Right? And so we just can't help ourselves, right?
Yeah.
So I'd started a little company in grad school. I was a programmer, just self-taught programmer, and left academia, left the tenured spot to go start or co-found a software company. Very boring software company, but interesting. Back up in the Northeast. So I've been up there since.
So where you're in the Northeast right now? Where in the Northeast are you?
Yeah, I live in the like to call it the wilds of Fairfield County, Connecticut. Which, if you've ever been to Fairfield County, Connecticut, in fact, you went to Yale, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
So you're familiar with the foibles, let's call it, of Fairfield County. So I grew up in Alabama, which is about as far away, in every respect, from Fairfield, Connecticut, than you can imagine.
Yeah. I actually went up to Connecticut to college from Florida, so I
fantastic.
Had a similar culture
well.
shock.
Yeah, right, exactly. So I've always been a kind of a fish out of water in a lot of respects, and I think that's what a lot of people over the last few decades, it's probably forever, have felt that way, and it's always in. I'll say technology writ large that I've found a way to reinvent myself and find a path to both satisfy my own intellectual interests and also provide for a family. So that's the plan.
And that's so you moved up to Fairfield, and that's another phase of life that is I guess the farm phase, for lack of a better term.
Well, look,
which has been a source of many of your metaphors, which kind of brings us to the more recent installment. You've created Epsilon Theory, which is how I came across you. And in this blog that's based on kind of a game theoretic and historical interpretation of market behavior and human behavior, you use many of your personal experiences from the farm, which I find absolutely fascinating and quite insightful.
Well, thank you, Matthew. I appreciate that. Yeah, I started writing, like I say, just a blog. A little over 5 years ago, and really I was just writing to myself. I was kind of I wound down the hedge fund that I'd been working with, and was trying to figure out what had happened in markets, because we've had a real sea change in market behavior really since the great financial crisis. And the Federal Reserve and other central banks taking on up a whole new set of policies and powers, really starting in March of 2009. And so I was trying to figure this out, and I was kind of in, like, say, in a dark place trying to figure this out. And I was just writing a note to myself, really, and I sent it out to about 100 clients, friends, and for whatever reason or combination of reasons, it really struck a chord. And so, and I know these numbers aren't meaningful in kind of the larger, mass media area, but in our little pond of financial services, it's grown to be a pretty big thing. About 100,000 people on the email distribution.
Yeah,
and that's
no small mailing list.
Well, but the great thing is, it's all been through word of mouth. It's all been through people finding it, discovering it.
It's organic, and people. It's comprised of people who care.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. It's people, as I like to call it, who are in the world. These are successful. They tend to be successful technologists or investors or financial advisors, but they're not necessarily of the world, right? Really trying to find their place. As I've been trying to find my place, and I do find it so useful to write about nature, to write about life on it's a dilettante farm. I mean, I'm like Eddie Albert on Green Acres, which way predates, I think, most of the people in your audience. But I'm a complete poser when it comes to taking care of animals and driving the tractor. But the wonderful thing is that the land, and I'll call it farming, and I'm putting air quotes around it as we're talking. It's very forgiving, and it particularly in a place like Fairfield, Connecticut, right, where if I have a bad day, I can go to the local, trattoria and get their amuse-bouche and some artisanal mezcal.
It's not actually life and death.
It's not. This is not the Jones.
The grain stores go
right?
bad. The village is not, attacking itself.
That's right. This ain't grapes of wrath material, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, there is something both evocative but also intensely satisfying about working in nature and seeing the patterns of nature.
I was just going to say, you don't necessarily have to be dependent on the patterns to observe them.
That's exactly right. And in fact, it's a wonderful luxury not to be dependent upon them. It allows you to step back a bit more and, watch the bees, right? Not to try to
quite literally in your case. I saw the beehive in a recent video,
and it's wonderful because I and this maybe isn't interesting, maybe not, but the history of beekeeping is fascinating, really. And we're most familiar with these boxes where you see beehives, right? Or call it bee colonies. Yeah. And what's interesting to me is that box that we're most familiar with, for anyone who's seen
the white boxes that are stacked with the
white
drawers
boxes
in them.
Exactly right. Those were invented by a German preacher, right, by the name of Langstroth. And of course it was a German, he was an engineer at first and they became, religious. But of course it is, right, because those boxes are designed to maximize honey production. Yeah.
Right? An efficient linear process.
That's exactly right. They're pre-done to really not exactly force, but certainly almost force, encourage the bees to create their brood and their comb in a very prescribed way.
Like extremely unnatural constraints imposed by an outside force to harvest or harness
that's right.
the power of nature.
That's exactly right. And I don't have to do that.
A steam engine for bees.
That was basically it. Right. And because I'm not trying to maximize honey production, I can take a very different approach, which is essentially the way people started, I'll say, cultivating bees way back in the day, which is it's the equivalent of a hollow log. It's called a top bar hive, and it doesn't have the enforced structure of the Langstroth hive, but instead it lets the bees be bees.
Yeah.
Right, and it's perfect for what I'm trying to get out of my dilettante farming, right?
Mm-hmm.
I still like animals that pay the rent.
Yeah.
You know, I like the chickens. I like the sheep that we shear. I like the bees that give us honey. But because I don't have the requirement to make a living out of this,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a wonderful luxury, it does allow me to see these animals not in a necessarily natural way, but in a more harmonious way with their nature,
Mm-hmm.
with their nature.
Yeah.
And it's looking at those patterns, then I'm able to find, I think, some very interesting, not just corollaries, but real lessons for
Mm-hmm.
how human behavior operates.
Yeah.
Whether we're talking about chickens or bees or you name it.
Yeah, that's something that's always fascinated me. About a decade ago, when I was studying evolutionary psychology,
Mm-hmm.
one of the courses I was taking was the evolution of language.
Yep.
And in the evolution of language course, we also discussed the evolution of bee communication, and what we understand about how bees communicate through movement, complex movements within their hive, and the ability of a bee to, for example, understand where they've been when they were out looking for pollen, for example, or flowers that that are in bloom, and then be able to, through a particular type of dance or the waggle dance, come back into that hive and effectively create a pattern of vibration that spreads through the collective intelligence of this bee brain, so to speak, and then through that expression change the collective behavior of the entire colony and kind of shift its collective agency, which seems quite related to a lot of the types of things you talk about when it comes to talking about things like the common knowledge problem.
Well, that's exactly right, Matthew. And one of the first lessons I learned about beekeeping and being a successful beekeeper is to understand that the animal
Mm-hmm.
is really not the individual bee.
Yeah.
The animal is the colony.
Mm-hmm.
And once, and that seems kind of easy to say, but you only really experience it when they're zipping at you and you're looking for the queen, and it changed everything for me. I got stung a lot less. I was much gentler with the bees. I was able to handle the bees better,
Mm-hmm.
to really absorb this notion that the animal is the colony.
Yeah.
It's not the individual bee. And what I will tell you is that has changed so much my understanding of markets and investing and politics and voting. The animal is not us as individuals, mm-hmm. right, in terms of our voting or investment behavior. The animal truly is the crowd. And there are such wonderful tools within game theory to try to understand the strategic interaction of crowds,
Mm-hmm.
right, as opposed to how we typically think of game theory, which is in a 2x2, prisoner's dilemma or a game of chicken or the like. And the other thing I'll say about this, and your point about language is so important. For my money, right, the absolute best work that's happening in game theory today, it's not in economics departments, right? It's in evolutionary biology departments, yes, but you kind of expect that, I think,
Sure.
hawks and doves and, these kind of, well-known games and patterns.
Yeah, actually trying to build the emergent models of the phenomena
That's
that are being
right.
studied.
That's right.
Yeah.
But linguistics, there's
Mm-hmm.
wonderful work in game theory happening in linguistics.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's those two fields that I
Yeah.
find are most useful for finding the to get your chops,
Yeah.
right, if you will, at applying game theory to a phenomenon like markets.
Because those are kind of two sides of the same coin in the sense where the biological tends to skew towards which of these patterns are reproducing and how those dynamics unfold, and then the linguistics are how are the patterns generated and spread.
That's exactly
so it's
right.
kind of the two sides of this, this game being played, iterated across evolutionary time.
That's very well put. And of course, the other common denominator, right, when we're talking about language with bees and with human beings, is that they're eusocial animal, EU social animals, right? And there are really only a few species in the world that fall under that category. And if you ever read anything about E.O. Wilson,
I love E.O. Wilson. Oh, he's one of my favorite. Like Consilience changed my life. That book changed my life.
I feel the same way, right? And this book, the Social History of Earth, it's just I defy anyone to read it and not have their lives changed.
Part of my current mission is also trying to socially upregulate his ideas around dual inheritance theory.
I hear you on that. I hear you on that. Because there are a lot of aspects of his work I think that need work, right? Or could certainly use, as you're describing, updating.
They were rough pictures.
But that's the way all science works. But this notion that and there are a few characteristics of what defines a eusocial animal, right? It's job specialization, it's multiple generations essentially living in the same nest, right? Different generations taking care of the young, right? The brood.
Yeah.
Right? And what's fascinating to me, though, is the other aspect of this is that for a eusocial species, they all swim in an ocean of intra-species communication. That's the oxygen really they breathe, and and I don't think it's any accident that, for my argument would be the four most successful multicellular species on Earth: the termite, the ant, the bee, and the human. Those are your four best examples of a eusocial species.
Yeah.
And what they all have in common is this notion of language, that they are immersed in language and messaging. They are, in the case of bees, termites, and ants, they are truly hardwired to respond to the pheromones of the queen, let's say, right? But there's a lot of hardwiring in humans as well. And there's a lot of what I call soft wiring.
Yeah. As unpopular as all of this is to discuss in 2018, but
there's a lot of that,
yeah,
right? And so that there are these stories, right? These narratives, which truly do have power over us, and it's not an absolute power, as I do a lot of work in the field of natural language processing. And I think there's some neurolinguistic program that those letters NLP stand for something else.
Neurolinguistic programming,
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a lot of that's kind of a lot of hooey, I think.
Sure.
Right?
At the very least, like highly unproven.
highly, right? Yeah. So I'm not trying to say that like words are like a magic spell but there's an element to this.
But they kind of are.
Yeah. They kind of are,
Yeah.
and they're just not just examples, but again, looking at it through the lens of linguistics, you can really have a toolkit to try to understand how language developed as humankind developed. And I'm not so hard going to say that, our grammar defines the way we think, right? But there's an element to that. There really is.
Not like not necessarily a hardcore Derrida, nothing
exactly.
outside the text.
Right.
supporter,
I'm not that far.
Sure.
But I will.
But we do swim in this sea of language.
We swim in this sea of language, and when I think to myself, in any given day, and I know there have been studies about this, how many messages are you peppered with? And I think, are there any periods of time during the day where I'm not immersed in message? How long does it go before I have a message of my waking time?
Yeah,
and it's darn few. It's darn few, and a lot of it is imposed on me, and a lot of it I impose on myself with my little dopamine machine.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
and even if not the dopamine machine, the unconscious will surface thoughts even if you're just by yourself.
Absolutely.
So you're even kind of subject to your own notification stream, if you will.
And it becomes but this obsession, and it is an obsession to communicate and be to both message and be messaged. You see it all through nature, and you particularly see it in nature on the farm, which is all about how do you control or how do you harness animals, and so it can go to the extreme of creating the Langstroth hive, right, where by God you are forcing the bees in a very prescribed manner. But it's also true in the way that humans work with horses, with dogs, with goats and sheep. It's all part of this. Yeah. Right, where we are, the animal, not just the eusocial animals, but all animals, they want to be part of something, right? Whether it's a pack or a flock or you name it. Yeah. Right, and humans have been so good over thousands of years at figuring out how to control these animals. Well, let me tell you, humans are also really good at figuring this out for controlling us. And that's what I try to write about in Epsilon Theory.
Yeah, I think you do a wonderful job of that, to try to maybe take a few of these threads that we've opened up and weave them into a pattern that might help give some insight into the metagame that you so frequently talk about. Our technology obviously is a way, in the same way that the beehive that was created, what was his name one more time?
Langstroth.
The Langstroth beehive was a particular type of hive that was designed for a particular incentive landscape, and took a complex system and kind of constrained that system, irrespective of many other variables in the natural system. It wasn't necessarily concerned with, for example, the spread of disease through that, perhaps, or the overall stability or health of this colony when introduced to future technologies or pesticides or whatnot. So to some extent, we might be in a world in which the extreme spread of this particular type of hive for the purpose of maximizing honey production has destabilized or made far more fragile the entire ecosystem of bee pollination.
And the other thing it really lends itself to is our particular breeds of bees, right? So
hyper specialization,
right? Yeah, no, you're spot on. Yeah.
And so then
actually domestication in general, there's this wonderful book called Domesticated, which looks at pretty much about a dozen different animal species that have been domesticated, right? From the cow to the dog to the horse to the pig, you name it. And it takes it really explores obviously there's the phenotype changes that you see in animals as they become domesticated, and also looking at kind of how at a genotype level what's being selected for and how that progresses over thousands of years as an animal species is domesticated. So without exception, literally without exception, domesticated animals, their faces become more infantile, right? The ears become floppier, and the brains become smaller. And there's a number of hormonal expressions that kind of control a lot of this. But it's just an amazing thing that domestication, which of course is this combination of structure and in some cases, some species, the language and the processes you use, but how it over time it absolutely has a profound impact on the biology, and I suspect it's the same with humans as well.
Yeah, and that's and upon that fundamental domestication or self-domestication, perhaps, that we are imposing upon ourselves, in a way that simultaneously perhaps opens some doors and closes others for the future of our culture and our species. I'm curious in terms of the role of technology, right? Because something I kind of think quite a bit about is this tension between individual autonomy and collective agency,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so there's to some extent, humans have balanced this ability to allow individuals to go explore the world outside the, rigid constraints or tyrannical constraints of a collective, while allowing for the collective to still have an overall direction, an overall agency to kind of guide and parameterize the lives of individuals. And it seems that even though we are eusocial, as you mentioned, we have far more individual autonomy than the other three species you mentioned. But I'm curious if we are, as part of our technological curve, removing that from ourselves by connecting ourselves via tools like the internet. If we are connecting ourselves in a way that means we are less capable of allowing for individual autonomy, that we are now so closely connected to one another and so closely part of this group watching the group game, that we're actually making ourselves more like the bees and less human.
Yes, it's self-imposed and it's also other-imposed. And what I mean by that is that, look, successful politicians have known about the power of language and the power of specific language in terms of narrative arcs, and also getting a crowd to focus on looking at itself. And I'll come back to that in a second. What's new today, I think, are two things. The first is that everybody's in on the act, right? So the tools and the techniques of, whether we call in game theory the missionary effect, the person who stands in front of a megaphone and speaks to a crowd, that technique has become very widespread. So this is why, for example, you can't go a day without some governor of the Federal Reserve giving a speech, right? That's a very conscious policy to be out there and to give their forward guidance, not because the communication is necessarily an accurate reflection of what they really think about the economy or monetary policy, but this isn't a tinfoil hat thing. This is an avowed, they call it communication policy. The goal is, through their words, to try to influence, in this case, investor behavior. That they want to choose their words in order to affect or change that behavior, not because it's the words they actually believe. What we might call lying under other circumstances, right?
Or tapping into the separation between, I guess you've described in other articles, like the biological reality of Lyme disease and Lyme disease.
Right, the meme,
the mimetic
the
layer.
name. That's right, the mimetic layer.
These two different layers that can be interacted with in different manners.
And it's now everywhere. Right? It's ubiquitous, and so it's both something we pull upon ourselves because it is entertaining. This is a dopamine machine. Yeah. Right. And I love it. I'm hooked on it. I am. Right. I kid myself. Oh, it's kind of my business. I need to develop my Twitter following or whatever. But that's a load of BS. It's because I'm getting that bzz, bzz, bzz of the pleasure from participating in this game that we call Twitter, or what have you.
Which may have some positive externalities, but
yeah,
also plenty of negative.
It does, but and this is the other part about the technology here, right? Which is that, yes, there's a wonderful aspect of the development of the internet and our different technologies for disintermediation, right? Meaning that you, Matthew, you can do this podcast, and by God, if you keep at it and you keep doing good work at it, you can get a really big audience, right? There's no gatekeeper that
fingers crossed.
There you go. There you go. There's no gatekeeper that prevents you from doing this.
Yeah.
There's no arbiter of access that exists anymore.
Yeah.
But at the same time, the economics and the need for scale has never been greater in our business, in any business, right? I'm talking about financial services where, it's insane. I mean, it is literally insane how scale has just enveloped, every aspect of financial services. But it's true in healthcare, It's true in any sort of media business. It's true in technology. So what this means is that at the same time that the technology allows for disintermediation, allows for a voice like yours or like mine to find an audience, at the same time, the megaphones have never been in a more powerful position. Mm-hmm. And what's fascinating for me in financial services, at least, is that there are really only 4 megaphones for the common knowledge game. And let me describe what I mean by common knowledge. Common knowledge is a piece of information that we believe everyone else has heard. Mm-hmm. And so as a professional investor, if someone says something on Bloomberg or on the Wall Street Journal or on, God help us, CNBC, or on the FT, particularly for European, if a message appears on any one of those 4 and only those 4 platforms, then I, as a professional investor, must assume that every other professional investor has heard it. And that's what creates common knowledge. So access to these platforms, and this is the weird world in which we live, a world of disintermediation, but it's a world where those 4 platforms have never been more important. And what those 4 platforms then create, and this is clear to anyone who's been in the business, if you're able to get your message out on that platform, then that creates enormous power over people's behavior. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's almost as if there's still even though we've disintermediated the gatekeepers, even though we can create a bottom-up flow of information, because the standards, there are no necessary standards. It tends to be discounted unless it's a downstream amplification of the signal by the 4 mainstream signals.
Exactly right.
So it's like if you're talking about an article that was written by the New York Times, people can still relate to that far more than if you're trying to kind of create a new narrative.
That's it exactly. And it creates, and there are lots of interesting, I think, tools and techniques that again, what we call missionaries, people with access to these megaphones use. And the most prominent technique, one of the most successful techniques, is right at the beginning of whatever it is you're talking about. What you want to do, first of all, is make the audience pay attention to themselves. So I'll give you an example. Whatever you think of, and we don't have to go into this. Whatever you think about Donald Trump and his policies, what I would suggest to you is he's really good at playing this game. I think it's because of his background, probably as a reality TV star, right? But
like induced reflexivity in whoever is watching.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So whatever speech you, so listen for this or watch for this the next time you see the Donald give one of his talks, particularly at a campaign rally or at any sort of event. The first thing he'll do is he'll comment on the size of the crowd. Mm-hmm. Remember at the inauguration where all evidence to the contrary, we had photographs, aerial photographs that the crowd was a lot smaller than at Obama's inauguration. But all evidence to the contrary, he made such a big deal out of saying over and over, more people were at this inauguration than any other. I say, all evidence to the contrary. That's a very conscious decision, and it's incredibly effective because it doesn't even matter if the crowd believes that they're the biggest crowd to ever be at the inauguration. It primes the crowd to start looking around at each other. And that is how this whole gameplay, the dynamics of the common knowledge game work, is for the crowd to be looking around at the crowd. And so a successful missionary, that's the trick they use. And that's why I really think that the Donald is so successful at using this toolkit.
Yeah. And
it's
so
tremendous.
Just for clarification, once that reflexivity is opened up and once the crowd has been primed, maybe you could speak a little bit to the types of behavior that opens them to, or that how does this make us susceptible to coercion or to seeding of behavior that might not be in our own interests? What happens to the crowd after they are made reflexive?
Well, so I'll give a specific example from running a hedge fund, right? Which is that 8 times a year. It's going to go to 12 times a year, but over the past 10 years, 8 times a year, the Fed, the Federal Reserve, the Open Market Committee, has a meeting where they announce what they're doing with interest rates.
Mm-hmm.
It's the single most important decision that's made in terms of whether markets go up or down,
Mm-hmm.
bar none. And I say 8 times a year because they will, at 10 minutes after 2, typically 2 p.m. Eastern time, they will, it's like the white smoke or whatever it is from the the papal
Yeah.
conclave, right? The report. Here's our decision, right? And it's a couple of paragraphs long. That'll get released, and immediately the market will move up or down depending on whether that decision was anticipated or expected, right? But whatever movement occurs from 2:10 p.m. to 2:30 p.m., everything changes at 2:30. Because at 2:30, 2 things happen. First is that, again, 8 times a year they have a press conference. So it's an opportunity for the missionary, whether it was Ben Bernanke or then Janet Yellen or now Jerome Powell, to get out there and to not just we raised interest rates by a quarter point or we held it flat or what have you, but to actually give a message,
Mm-hmm.
right? To talk, to jawbone, right? As we described. Also, exactly at that period of time, exactly at 30 minutes past the hour, this has changed a little bit in the last year or two, but for about 7 or 8 years ago, there was a Wall Street Journal writer named John Hilsenrath, who precisely at 30 minutes past the hour would write, again, in one of these platforms, these media megaphones, the Wall Street Journal, and he would write an article. We already knew what the decision was, but John Hilsenrath would write an article telling you, gentle reader, how you should think about the decision.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what a missionary does. They're not giving you the news. They're not a newscaster. I use a famous slide where there's a picture of every famous politician or banker or you name it, investor in the world. I can give you a picture of that person shaking his or her finger at the audience. And this is such a powerful meme and tool. The shaking their finger at you, again, they're not telling you what the news is. They're telling you how to think about the news. What does it mean that the Fed kept interest rates flat or raised it by a quarter point or lowered it by a quarter point? It's that shaking their finger at you and telling you how to think about the world that is what the missionary conveys. And whether or not you believe, like I was a hedge fund manager, and like I said, there's a lot of money at stake with what the Fed is doing. And so I would have my own views about what the Fed should do, right? And almost immediately you get rid of that very quickly, right? Because who cares what you think, right? It's what everyone else thinks. So then your thought is, all right, well, what was the consensus? What was the prediction? And that's the movement that happens from 10 minutes after to 30 minutes after. And there's a little bit of movement. It maybe goes up, maybe it goes down. But then John Hilsenrath or the Fed chair, him or herself, will get out there and tell you how to think about it. And almost always I disagree with them, mm-hmm. personally. But again, it doesn't matter what I think. And it doesn't even matter what the consensus was going into the decision. What matters, and this is why my change in behavior is very rational, if I think that every other investor is hearing this information, I must act as if I believe in that information as well. That is absolutely the rational thing to do. So even though I think that a lot of what Hilsenrath was writing was nonsense and was meaningless, right? I'm looking around, I'm thinking, look, everyone else is hearing the same message.
Yeah.
And I know that they're all smart enough that they're all looking around hearing the same message. And so the way this game is played, the rational decision is for each individual cell of the animal, right? Each member of the crowd is to, the emergent behavior is to act as if what that missionary is saying is true. It's an incredibly powerful phenomenon.
Yeah.
And you've seen it for thousands of years in human history, right? Like I say, this is why coronations are still held in public, right? This is why executions used to be held in public. It wasn't to get a crowd of people to see the poor guy getting hanged. It was so everybody could see the crowd watching the poor guy getting hanged.
Yeah. It's like a reaffirmation of the consensus of the collective behavior.
It is, and lots of writers write, whether it's the panopticon, right? It's knowing that you're being watched by the crowd. And it's not only just some sort of emotional bias or weirdness we have. No, it's a very rational decision that we're looking around and we see the message that's going out to the entire crowd. It's entirely rational for us to act as if we believe it too. The thing about it also is that once you start looking for it, you see it everywhere.
Yeah. Another place where this might be, I think it is completely evident, is within, and this might be a good place where we could switch to the space of decentralized economy or Bitcoin.
Sure.
Because I think there's something quite relevant along those lines as well, which is I've been watching these quote unquote markets. I don't know how you'd feel about me using the term markets for talking about, what's happening with Bitcoin prices. But it is fascinating.
It's a market. It's a poor market, but that's okay.
So this is, I'm just trying to be somewhat careful. We're precise with the language at the moment. We obviously have exchanges and there are marketplaces for exchanging these tokens of value. So market. But it's fascinating to me to think about in the same way that there is a dissociation between in normal market, or like in our normal financial markets, between the behavior of value investment in terms of people who are thinking about trying to assess the actions of those individuals who are taking resources and capital and trying to alter the course of reality in some way, creating some good or service to overall create value for some element of society, right? Like maybe you're making, to use your favorite example, Teslas. Whether or not people agree on that value proposition is one thing, but at least somebody's actually trying to make cars. Then there's a layer on top of that, which is the people signaling about beliefs about making cars, right? And that's happening at a much faster time frame. It's happening oftentimes at scales of time that like microseconds or nanoseconds, scales of time that have very little bearing on the underlying car making process, right? And it seems as if there's a connection between those two realities, although it can become tenuous and it can diverge, and when it does so, you can get very destructive situations. But it seems as if, at least to me, watching the crypto markets or the Bitcoin markets, that given the absence of the former, in terms of like there's so little, there's a lot that is somewhat real in terms of what's going on with Bitcoin development. But that being said, there's far less activity going on to drive prices in terms of actual Bitcoin engineering. Like the prices aren't going up based on like code commits. And what's happening is people are, it's the most TA driven market in the world, I would argue. And so people are believing in these rules of TA, and therefore
just for the audience, sorry. So you're talking technical analysis.
Technical analysis, right? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'm forgetting. I'm just kind of getting wrapped up in the jargon. But yeah, technical analysis, which is, here is this set of patterns to look for, and if you see these patterns, then you should effectively move in a certain direction or behave in a certain way. And it's interesting to me that it seems like this inescapable loop is created where, because it's such a, it's a 24/7 market, everybody's always watching the market, and it's so TA driven that the market actually begins to conform at a higher rate to the patterns of technical analysis, thus reinforcing the belief in technical analysis. So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. At least it feels that way.
There's a lot of truth in what you're saying. And let me back up a second, because I think the worst thing that ever happened to Bitcoin or to crypto in general is that they became, I'll call it, publicly traded securities. I think the best thing in the world for Tesla would be to be a private company. You can't unring these bells, of course, right? But the reason I say this is, as soon as you have a as soon as you have a crowd trading a security, as soon as you have a securitization of something, right, where you're no longer trading the underlying economic widget or the like, but you're trading a piece of paper, right, or an electronic, credit or debit or whatever the representation is of the underlying thing, right, the fundamental economic activity of a car manufacturer, right. And I'm going to come back to Bitcoin because what is the fundamental activity, right? Is it just, are we securitizing, ledger calculations? You're right. In a sense, that's what you are, and I get that, right? And there's both.
With the storage of excess energy on a ledger,
right,
exactly. What are we exactly?
But it's clearer, I think, in something like a Tesla, for example. Again, you can't unring the bell, but once you start trading the little piece of paper that's the stock in Tesla, there's a separation from the underlying, fundamentals of that company. And particularly in, again, this day and age of the dopamine machines and the always on, the game aspect of public securities markets, then the game playing takes over. It absolutely does. So I'll give you another example, and this will be, I think, more relevant for the power of narrative and why I get so. I'm such a big fan. I find that both Tesla and crypto in general, I find them to be so elegant and fascinating, and I'm rooting for them, and I love everything about it. But when it enters this world that I've been immersed in of public markets, it is so infested by people who intentionally play the games really well to separate well-meaning people from their money, that it just eats me up.
Yeah,
it just eats me up. So, and this is the way that public markets were considered before World War II, right? So bear with me a second. But if you look at the histories and the biographies of people like Andrew Carnegie, right, or Jay Gould, who cornered the gold market in the 1870s, or the Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, the robber barons, right? And you read about how they made their fortunes on Wall Street. They're not talking about free cash flow models. They're not talking about the economic fundamentals of the Erie Railroad Company or, a canal company or what have you. No, what they are doing, and this is what Wall Street meant, this is what trading public securities meant before World War II, was all about narrative. Even a lot of the language that we still use in markets, where we talk about cornering a market, right? So getting a corner, that was what trading, that's what Wall Street was all about. Again, for 100 years or several hundred years, getting a corner meant promoting a story that would get everybody on one side or another of a stock, and then you could set yourself up to, that reversal. You'd be positioned for that reversal for the stock either going way up or way down.
Yeah.
And so we still use that word, I'm going to corner the market. it means that's what getting a corner meant. It meant getting everybody to one side or another of the market. And so what you read about with these titans of Wall Street and the fortunes they made, it was all about playing the game of markets. It was all about creating these stories and narratives to get everybody on one side or another of a stock. Right?
Yeah.
And on the flip side, making sure that they weren't taken by someone else's stories. And we and you see this in so many aspects of particularly American culture, but Western culture in general. After World War II, particularly in the U.S., you have this this scientificization of everything.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we started talking about the Department of Government at Harvard, right? Well, it was after World War II where departments of political science are established, you know, all over in the U.S. Everything becomes scientificized, and everything becomes, I'll say, popularized. So in the 1960s, it was called the Thundering Herd. It was the Merrill Lynch, and the salesman took Wall Street onto Main Street. And it was both the popularization, and so what's the story to drive, you know, a doctor or a lawyer and, you know, on Main Street to put money into the stock market, which didn't happen before World War II. Mm-hmm. Well, we have to have the story of science, and that became the narrative. And look, like most narratives, there's a lot of truth to it. There's a lot of truth to doing free cash flow analysis and understanding the fundamentals of company X and company Y. But I feel like we've largely forgotten the lessons of those robber barons in terms of what drives security prices up or down. And while we, the ordinary investor, may have forgotten about it, Wall Street's never forgotten about it. And there are a lot of what I call raccoons out there who create and maintain these stories, again, to separate people from their cash.
Yeah.
And that's what I see, and it's so powerful and frankly easy to do in companies where the fundamentals become divorced from the security that you're trading.
Yeah.
And from the outset, Bitcoin and other cryptos are separate. You know, there's really no there in terms of the fundamentals. So it becomes all story and all narrative. And we convince ourselves that the narrative that we're hearing is right and correct. And all I can tell you is that, and I saw this in 2008 and 2009, the people who got us into the great financial crisis, a lot of them are in crypto now, right? Doing the same, I'm going to call it a scam, and what I mean by it is the same way of using words and language and narrative and creating a story to take your money from you.
Yeah.
And again, that just eats me up so much. It's hard for, I get portrayed, and probably rightly so, as being anti-Bitcoin or anti-crypto. And that's really not true. But what I am so anti, and I don't think you can separate it, are these thieves, right, who infest financial services, absolutely infest financial services.
Yeah.
And who are there using their narratives, right, to take your money from you. And it just ends badly.
Yeah, I definitely see that pattern. And I think the question I've been asking myself recently is, you know, there's this tension between centralization and decentralization across really almost any complex system. And, you know, in a highly centralized financial system, you have, you know, the raccoon types clustering around the centers of the network where a lot of value flows, right?
Yep.
So that was like kind of the 2008 crisis, where you had a financial innovation in a particular risk analysis method.
Yep.
And that allowed a large amount of people who were kind of close to that source of innovation to push a particular narrative, spin a particular narrative, and get a large amount of the public on board with that, internalizing the profits or centralizing the profits while externalizing or diffusing the risks.
The risks, yep.
And then it all blew up when it turned out that particular...
We had a nationwide decline in home prices.
Yeah, when it turned out that particular equation...
That was the assumption that everything was built on.
Yeah.
A $10 trillion asset class
Yeah.
was built on the assumption that it was impossible to have a nationwide decline in home prices. If you violated that assumption, it all comes tumbling down.
And the algorithm that was used to evaluate that risk on the way up was completely incapable of evaluating risk on the way down. So everything blew up. And it seems to some extent what we have now is a similar pattern, but if you invert the direction of the flow, like where we have decentralized marketplace where we're like ICOs, for example, where this pattern of trying to get the money to flow from the edges of the system, the bottom, up the mountain to companies that were trying to create something of value, presumably. And so you have a crowdfunding model, effectively. But we don't really have we didn't have any mechanism in place of identifying best practices or what it looks like, what predatory behavior in that domain looks like, or how to...
Yeah, but see, there's a reason why we have the Securities Acts of 1934 or 1935, which is that the asymmetry of information for someone offering an ICO, an unregulated ICO, and the person buying it, that the asymmetry of information there, it is a used car salesman selling you a lemon, maybe.
Yeah.
Right.
Likely.
Likely.
I mean, you see this all over Twitter.
And I'll use that, on steroids. But to it is that used car salesman asymmetry of information. At a factor higher.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's good reason, I believe, to have. I mean, this is. I even hate to use the word libertarian because it's gotten so tarred and feathered with so much baggage, but there is a role for government.
Sure.
Right, and that role, I think, is in the enormous scope of predatory commercial activity that can happen when you've got these asymmetries of information, and it happens so much with anything to do with a securities offering, right? So I hear you on the whole decentralization side, but there is a role, there's a need for centralized regulatory authority over anything to do with securities. I really believe that in my heart, because the ability and the power for a smooth-talking, raccoon to take advantage of that asymmetry of information is overwhelming.
Yeah.
And I'm not a paternalistic guy. I'm not trying to, hold people's hands and have them not take risk if they want to take risk. But I'm just saying, it's just this is not something new I'm talking about, right? This has happened thousands of times over history, and it always ends up the same freaking way. And I'll tell you the other aspect of the centralization versus decentralization issue that I have, which is that the reason we have centralization, the reason we have governments is to issue money, to tax, period, full stop.
Yeah. To monitor and regulate the flow of value within a society.
But in a very specific way. So in order to confiscate a slice of that, but why? For good reasons, right? For the tragedy of the commons issues, things that we couldn't provide for ourselves, like security or regulation, right?
I mean, one can look at the brain as a centralized tyrant if you really want to frame it that way.
If you want to go, sure. So there are, I think, very legitimate, necessary reasons for government. And at its core, the existential reason for government is to, they call it, seniorage, right? Which is not SEN, but SEIGN, the seniorage, right? But it's basically taking their cut, to pay for these activities.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to set up an alternative money, right, that and this is why governments, hate gold so much, right, for thousands of years. And so the argument, this is either digital gold or it's a store of value, or that in the coming, hell to pay that this is going to be how people, keep what's theirs. I'm so sympathetic to that. I am so sympathetic to that. And yet, because it is just overwhelmed with the raccoons who are there to steal your money, and because it is antithetical to why governments exist, and so when the shit hits the fan, they're going to fight that with every fiber of their being. That's why I just have a hard time with the true believers, right? Because I feel like I know how this story is going to end. And it doesn't mean that I don't see value in it and elegance in it and uses for it. I do. But innovation, financial innovation, it just always ends in tears.
So in kind of putting on my evolutionary biologist hat, in terms of looking at innovation ending in tears, part of me
financial innovation ending, and I don't mean innovation.
Sure.
Financial innovation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess then the question would be exactly what it is that makes financial innovation in your mind particularly likely
egregious
to lead to these types of tiers. But I'm curious because what I'm trying to differentiate that from is just the tendency of like any mutation or any like in a genetics manner, like most mutations are bad mutations, right? Most mutations are lethal mutations.
That's right.
And even the mutations that might eventually confer evolutionary or adaptive value within one niche, in many other niches are also bad solutions. And so there's a lot of evolution is quite a effective solution, but the cost that efficacy comes at is a lot of death, right? A lot of failed experiments. And so I'm curious because I definitely, the crypto world has been quite familiar with a lot of death over the past year. I mean, this market has, I think, something like 90% of the coins that cropped up over the past 2 years have died, which is probably a good thing. And I'm completely with you in terms of trying to, I also wonder at what point governments will begin to put a lot more, not only scrutiny, but energy into actively attacking these types of technologies and how effective that will be. But I am curious in terms of like, can we find emergent solutions to kind of trap raccoons? Like, is that possible with these new technologies? And what makes me a little sad is that I see a market in which we actually do have new game theoretical tools in these coins to experiment with things, yet we're falling back into the narrative-driven patterns, which would, I guess, speak to your point.
And this is what my whole point about it, going public.
Yeah.
Right. It ruins it. Right.
Yeah.
That you no longer have the luxury of time, because the both the pressure and the promise of becoming rich takes over.
Yeah.
It does. I mean, the things that are constant in the human experience with financial services is fear and greed. That is a constant, right? And that doesn't change, and that's why I'm so not just leery, but highly opposed to almost all financial innovation, right? Because everything, once it gets in that public sphere, again, that pressure to make money from it, because there are only two kinds of innovation. There are new ways to borrow money, new ways to find leverage, new ways to package assets so that you can borrow on it, new ways of repossess, hypothecation. These are all different ways of finding leverage, new ways to borrow money.
Yeah.
That's one. And the other form of innovation is a securitization, right? A new way to abstract a chip, a casino chip.
Yeah, symbolize some type of value.
To symbolize some sort of value. That's exactly right. That's it. That's it, right? And against that backdrop of fear and greed, what I find is that when something enters that public sphere of public trading, that you no longer have the time to experiment, explore, and try to develop. right? The opportunity is just so great and so tempting, and that's why as much as I love aspects of, I just don't believe that it's, how to say this. I'm so sympathetic to the goal of into the discomfort and frankly the near hatred, right, of the way that the system, the man, right, has set up this system, right, which preserves and accentuates and accelerates not just inequality of outcome, but also inequality of opportunity, and it just makes me so sad, right? But I know that this is not the way.
Mm-hmm.
This is not how I think effective resistance can take place. Because it's beset both by, again, attacking the existential reason why the state exists in the first place, and it falls prey on the other side to our absolute human nature of fear and greed. And then you take you put that in the crucible of time and pressures to get rich or
when you lower or when you increase the time preference, I suppose.
That's right.
So that's the thing that interests me, and I guess we're getting a little short on time since I guess you have a few more minutes left. But just to kind of put this out there from the perspective of kind of, I guess maybe the phenomenological perspective of psychology, there's an element of our behavior that is a combination of the interaction of what's in us and what we bring to that moment of an experience, and how those two elements interact. And it seems as if there are different elements of human psychology. There are different notes within us that can resonate with different circumstances or different games.
Yep.
And the question that I ask myself with respect to this emerging decentralized world, or this landscape of experimentation, if you will, is it possible for us to create scenarios or games in which we are resonating with notes other than greed or fear more frequently? Not that those don't exist. Is it possible for us
Matthew,
to lower the time preference?
What you're talking about is the reason I write Epsilon Theory. I told you I started writing it from a dark place.
Yeah.
It has been the most gratifying experience of my life to learn, and I didn't know this.
Yeah.
But there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of us out there, and by us I mean truth-seeking. Again, people who are making their way in the world, right? But are really trying to do better by themselves, by their family, by what I call their pack, right? And we're geographically disparate, right? But the wonderful thing about these tools of technology, it allows us to find each other. And to your question, yes, absolutely. I am convinced that there are a myriad of ways for packs and sub-packs to come together and do small goods in the world, right? I see it all the time. I travel all over, and everywhere I go, I see people solving little puzzles and righting little wrongs and doing little good things. And it gets hijacked and waylaid as soon as you put securities into it, as soon as you put money into it. And I know that sounds trite and silly, but it's so true. And whether it's participation around making, I love the whole maker movement. I'm a big believer in this, right? Because and this is the aspect of crypto that I find so invigorating. It's the maker aspect of this, not the get rich aspect of this.
Yeah, 100% with you on that.
And that's, but again, you can't unring these bells.
Yeah, I mean, I understand how that can lead to a dark place, because I'm also trying to struggle with that precise problem in terms of, and maybe we can have another conversation sometime about this, but the tension between wanting to perhaps symbolize more aspects of these behaviors that we observe as positive or helpful. We witness these communities creating value together, and then at least in the decentralized world right now, there's a strong tendency to want to then overlay these symbolic systems. And I think what I'm hearing you say is, from your perspective, that's probably likely to activate parts of those systems that will actually self-destruct.
So my motto,
yeah,
right, as an investor, is to be long volatility, meaning change happens, and I want to be part of that, right, part of that change, and I want to be short abstraction. Okay. Long volatility and short abstraction. That's my motto, and that's what I think we should be looking for here.
All right. Well, fair enough. I think that's a powerful, or I don't want to say it's a powerful abstraction. It's a powerful motto.
There you go. There you go.
But yeah, I really appreciate you coming in the show. And
it's my pleasure, Matthew. Really, anytime.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. Whew. As you can probably tell, I wish that conversation had at least another 30 to 45 minutes on it. Dr. Hunt had to run. He had a couple other appointments to get to, but in my opinion, we were really just starting to dig into the interesting bits around decentralization and centralization, the tension inherent there, and whether or not it makes sense to try to encapsulate certain parts of human behavior and human values, especially within collective or group situations, to try to encapsulate some aspects of those behaviors in symbols and encapsulate them symbolically, or as Dr. Hunt seemed to suggest, that attempting to do so, attempting to encode these aspects, more complex, nuanced aspects of human behavior symbolically, using either the models of securitization or increased leverage, as Dr. Hunt explicitly says in the interview, whether adding or securitizing or financializing those elements of our interpersonal behavior might, instead of making them more effective or more nuanced or more capable of actually encouraging positive collective behavior, might have the opposite effect. And it seemed to be, that's what Dr. Hunt and I were getting at towards the end of this conversation. And I really wish we had a little bit more time to examine that. And I would be really interested to hear in the comments below what you think about that. With that said, I'm going to wrap this up. And if you liked the episode, please let me know. Please like the episode. Please subscribe to the channel. And if you want to see more episodes like this, I would really encourage you to check out the Patreon account, patreon.com/catcoherence. And please consider supporting the show. I would like to, I would very much like to bring more high quality, in-depth conversations like this into the world, exploring the intersection of traditional and new economics, game theory, economics, history, evolutionary psychology, spirituality, all of these things. All these things should be explored in a way that I don't really see a lot of in the current media landscape, and I would like to do more of it. But at the moment, this is a hobby, and it's a fun hobby, and it's something that I really enjoy bringing to the world. But it's a hobby nonetheless, and if it could perhaps pay the bills, then I could really make this a full-time thing and bring more content to you. So with that said, and with that pitch out of the way, please consider that, and until next time, see you later.